Hello YouTube, this is Peter, finally back with a proper video. And if this video is a bit rambling, I apologize in advance. It's a bit like that episode of The Simpsons where Mr. Burns is at the doctor's and the doctor explains to him how he has all of these diseases, but they're all trying to force themselves through the doorway all at once and getting stuck in the doorway. And that's the only reason that Mr. Burns is still alive. That's a bit how my thoughts feel, all jammed in a doorway, trying to get out. And so I'm trying to parse them out as best that I can in a coherent fashion. Now, the most obvious thing, the elephant in the room, or more like the elephant that's taken a shit in the room, to use some political symbolism, is the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And there is the obvious bad news, and perhaps the less obvious bad news, and then maybe the potential, if not good news, then reasons for optimism or hope. So, aside from the obvious bad news of the decision itself, there's a pessimistic part of me that looks at things like this and unpacks why and how this happened. And the conclusion I can only reach is that this is the end result of a concerted effort by a political movement over many decades, over 40 years. It's taken the religious right and other factions within the Conservative Party, and the factions that used those factions within the Conservative Party as footstools and, stepping stools to power, to arrive at this moment. They fought through decades of disappointment with Reagan, and then with Bush, and then with another Bush, and with losing elections, and operating at all levels of government, from dog catcher up to the presidency, to make this moment happen. And then I look at the other side of the equation, the progressives, the liberals, the leftists, the fair-weathered Democrats, who basically can't seem to see past one election cycle. And they want to turn on the Democratic Party every time that they aren't given their dream list, that President Biden doesn't wave his magical president wand and enact all of their blue sky thinking ideas that he doesn't even have the votes for. There is an asymmetry in determination, in focus, in relentlessness, in commitment. They had a goal, they worked at it, they achieved it. It's very hard for me to imagine liberals behaving the same way. But here's the good news, or the potential reason for optimism, if there is such any in this situation. Because this is a situation that is going to deeply impact and hurt millions of people. So the good news is this, that we're facing a situation in this country in which we have a two-party system, and one of those parties is essentially running on borrowed time. 20 years ago, there was some thought within conservatism, within the Republican Party, to try and expand its appeal and expand its base. And then, around the time of the election of Barack Obama, they decided to hell with that. We're going to double down on an increasingly shrinking demographic. They're relying on primarily white Christian conservatives who are, with each passing generation, becoming a less and less significant portion of the American electorate. In the long to medium term, within the next roughly 25 years, the United States will no longer be a majority white country. It is no longer even a majority white Christian country. In fact, a lot of the panic and the way that the Republican Party and conservatives are behaving is because they know this. When Barack Obama was elected, or perhaps I'm misremembering and it was when he was reelected, Bill O'Reilly said something to the effect of, "This is the end of traditional America." Of course, he meant white Christian America, but he didn't want to say that. And in many ways, it was. But that doesn't mean that they weren't going to rage and rage and rage against the dying of the light. That didn't mean that they weren't going to have a temper tantrum on their way out. That didn't mean that they weren't going to do everything they could to cling to the levers of power and foist minority rule on the rest of us. That didn't mean that they wouldn't leave us with a giant mess that we'd be cleaning up for decades. In the more short term, at least by the standards of waiting till 2050, in the more short term, within approximately the next decade, millennials and Gen Z will be the primary voting bloc within the United States. And my generation and the younger generation are more socially and economically liberal and less religious than the baby boomer generation that is the core of the current Republican Party. The Republican Party, as it stands today, doesn't really stand any real chance in a democracy, in a functioning democracy, which they're working on that, in which the primary voting bloc is millennials and Gen Z. And in a lot of ways, I see this as being behind a lot of the reasons that they're basically shitting their pants at all of these things that sensible adults might wonder what they're going on about. Why all of a sudden moral panics over schools? It feels very much like the 80s all over again. They are making a last-ditch attempt to try and influence Generation Z, or the part of Generation Z that's still in school, and upcoming generations. Because, being baby boomers, many of them are still living in a very much analog world and analog mindset. So they're trying to ban certain books to keep the, critical race theory, LGBTQ agenda out of schools. They have to have moral panics over trans kids in bathrooms and trans kids playing sports and trans kids existing. They have to have all of these moral panics. And if you look at it, it's in many ways very much focused on the younger generations. They want to control the way that these generations are raised and taught to believe about America. Except there's a little flaw in their plan. And that flaw in their plan is basically much of the reason why these younger generations have a different worldview than they do. And it's called the internet. So, to give one example that I particularly found amusing, there was a school in which they tried to ban Toni Morrison's Beloved. And one of the PTA Karen people said that the book contained graphic sexual imagery and graphic sex scenes that she didn't want her precious little 15-year-old son to have to read. And this is laughable. Ma'am, does your son own a smartphone? Oh, he does? Oh, well, let me tell you something, ma'am. Here's the thing. Your son has already seen things that Toni Morrison could barely imagine, let alone describe in a book. And you're worried about literature in high school. It's really about the rest of the book, not any sex scenes in the book. You're worried that all of these ideas about race, sexuality, you want to keep little Johnny like in this bubble by taking all these things out of schools, by trying to push all of these things out of public consciousness. But this is the 21st century. The internet exists, and you can't. Now, of course, there are downsides to the internet, and we've been fixated on a lot of them for quite a while now. Fake news, letting the crackpots and the cranks and the nut jobs and the whack jobs all have their say and all get their followings and all have their day. And so we see a rise in conspiracy theories and people who believe in flat earth and people who believe that liberal elites are drinking, adrenochrome from children in the basement of pizza parlors. That's one aspect of the internet. But the internet has done so much more. And you almost have to look back to when the generation, these baby boomers and the people who are the primary voting bloc of the Republican Party, their generation grew up with a world of analog media in which what you learned was primarily through schools and through television. And maybe if you had a certain inclination, you could go to the library. But those channels of information were all very much, if not deliberately controlled through some vast conspiracy, because that wasn't really the case, they were confined in many ways. And going into a school, showing up at a PTA meeting and demanding that certain books be banned from schools, and trying to complain about things on television, all those things might have worked in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, maybe even the 90s. But we're past that now. We're past the point where you can hide things from the younger generations. All they're going to do is create a sense within the younger generation, not only that the older generations have failed them, which younger generations clearly certainly already feel, but the older generations are trying to lie to them and deceive them. And a lot of this cultural clash comes down to this access of information. Because these baby boomers, they grew up at a time when their third grade teacher told them about how in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and they just took all of that at face value. Younger generations, whether or not they're being taught by their third grade teachers or not, have the kind of access to information, and there's the kind of diffusion of information, even if people don't go seeking it out, it's diffused to the point of becoming common knowledge, and at some point someone's going to point it out to them, that when Columbus sailed the ocean blue and when the Spanish discovered the Caribbean and, Mexico, Central America, the Americas, that what they actually did when they got there would turn your stomach. And so these younger generations, they learn the truth about, say, what happened when Columbus actually discovered the Americas, and they think, wait a minute, why is there a holiday to this person? And that sets up this kind of culture clash between the generations raised with American exceptionalism and the generations who have access to a much wider pool of information, who realize that, no, this is a at the very least, whitewashed, sanitized version of history. They have a much broader understanding and access to American history and different perspective on all of these things. And these older generations, it's like they believe that if only they could get certain books out of school, that they could go back to this American exceptionalist view of society that they were raised with and refuse to abandon in spite of any and all evidence to the contrary. So you see this generational clash, and it's like they don't realize they can't win. Because again, the woman who wants to ban Beloved from a school, lady, your son has a smartphone. He's already, no. You have no, are you that clueless, or are you just a liar? So when I think about the situation and what's driving much of this, I find myself in very familiar territory, because what seems to be at the driver's seat of the Trumpist Republican Party is white Christian nationalism. Now, Christian nationalism is not Christianity as a whole, or even all of American Christianity. In fact, there's a very prominent group called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Christian nationalism weds a certain type of primarily Protestant Christianity with beliefs in American exceptionalism. And in essence, they believe in a mythological past of America in which white Anglo-Saxon Protestants created and set up this country to be a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country, and therefore they have a divine right and a birthright to rule this country, and that anything that deviates from that not only strays from the vision and the plan for America, but risks God's judgment in a kind of Old Testament magical thinking. So in the Old Testament, the nation of Israel is either behaving in ways that God likes, in which they rewarded, or they're straying from God, in which they're punished. And they apply this Old Testament thinking to the United States of America because they believe that the United States of America is special and blessed by God. I wore this t-shirt for this video, and of course, most of it is not showing up in the video, but it's from Warhammer 40,000, and it says, "These heretics refute the Emperor's holy right to rule," and then bottom it says, "Let them argue with the barrel of a gun." That has become the mentality of these people, that they have the divine right and the birthright to rule, and anyone who takes that power away from them is ruining America. And so they see the future of America, the more diverse, more progressive, more socially liberal future of America, as the absolute, not only ruining of America, but inviting God's wrath through their magical thinking. This is the mentality that we're up against. And again, to me, well, it all feels very familiar. When I decided to turn this channel from place that I used to host videos that I had made, like Lego videos and stuff like that, into opinionated dude talking to people on the internet, like what you're seeing now, I was in part inspired to speak up by things like Jesus Camp and by things like the 2004 election, in which the Republicans in the Bush campaign put onto the ballot in swing states like Ohio anti-gay marriage initiatives in order to juice the support of the evangelical vote to win those swing states. You know, leveraging bigotry and anti-LGBTQ sentiment in order to win an election. And what I saw in things like Jesus Camp was a generation of kids who were being taught a very stark worldview in which, if you remember, they're literally praying outside of the Supreme Court to end abortion in that movie. And that was, 2005, 2006 that came out, 15, 16 years ago now. And yeah, those kids grew up, and maybe some of them realized that they were LGBTQ and turned away from the church. Maybe some of them became atheists, but a lot of them, they probably still believe a lot of those same things to this day. And so do their parents, so do the counselors at the place. And if you watch that movie, realize that that's who we're dealing with here. And, you know, when I look back at my previous offerings on YouTube, it seems, I don't want to say irrelevant now, but there's a time and a place to debate things like the existence of God, the Kalam cosmological argument, and these sort of freshman undergraduate philosophy type discussions. And then there's a time to start to analyze how these people think, what their agenda is, how their power structure works, and more pertinent things like that, rather than get caught up in so many of these trifling arguments that, in many ways, looking back, have really been framed on their terms anyway. So instead of going at things from the angle of the past and the petty arguments with creationists, because most of those people, you're never going to change their mind, and you're never really going to break through to them, I think a more analytical approach to how their power structure works is at least one step in the right direction. To understand how this movement operates, how they achieved what they achieved, and what liberals could potentially learn from that. Because, again, this is a movement that worked for decades, for over 40 years, to accomplish this. They worked at all levels. And whereas on the other side, you have people who throw a temper tantrum and boo-hoo and want to take their toys and go home after every election cycle, in which they're even mildly disappointed that all of their blue sky thinking ideas were not enacted. The alternative to fighting back against Christian nationalism is to allow them to turn this country into Gilead from The Handmaid's Tale. But personally, I of course have to wonder, what use, what good is doing something like making a video like this? Of course, that's not all I can do. I can donate and volunteer and help support certain causes, and I try and do that as much as possible. But when I think back to, the late aught years, 2007, 8, 9, 10, that time frame during the height of, say, YouTube atheism, at the time it felt like it was speaking truth to a certain kind of power, that it was opening up a cultural space for the questioning of religion. But now it seems to be looked back on by many people as almost faintly embarrassing. That what were we thinking? What were we doing? What was the relevance of all this? Oh, yes, I was an angry atheist at one point. That sort of thing. And certain people, the ones that stuck with it all, they turned their attention elsewhere to different angles of politics, or they jumped on the anti-feminist bandwagon and helped fuel the right-wing backlash, or they did whatever they did. And so it definitely is a new age that requires a new approach, different cultural moment. And that's something that's been something I've had to consider quite a bit. If I'm going to affect things in any way, who do I try and reach and how? So obviously these right-wing people, they all want to control the minds of the younger generation, Gen Z. So am I supposed to come on here and be like, hey, fellow young people, it's Uncle Peter here. Let me tell you why the boomers suck. Let me tell you how, Meemaw is a crazy religious fanatic. I don't know. I don't know if I have that kind of appeal. I'm not really into the TikToks, maybe because I don't want to be spied on by China. Yeah, sorry, kids. I'm not cool in that way. I can't speak to the young people. And I know better than to think that I can change the mind of most of these sorts of people. So who to angle things towards? How to present it? An ongoing something that's going to have to be worked through step by step. But at the same time, I look at statistics like the decline of religion, the rise of the nones, of the people with no particular religious belief, the rise of people who are agnostic or atheist, and think that what I and people like myself did back then couldn't have had no effect at all. It can't be entirely unrelated to the trends that we're seeing. And the trends, by the way, are pretty stark. I mean, we were talking about significant gaps, generational gaps in religious belief, religious participation. And again, this is why doubling down on a certain voting demographic that is aging out and dying out is probably a bad long-term political strategy. But again, their short-term political strategy is to cling to power and foist minority rule on us in any way they can. But at a larger cultural level, they can't win. Because things like the internet allow rando people like me to put their ideas out there. Whereas, best case scenario, 30 years ago, I might have been able to get on, public access cable or in something like that. Like how Alex Jones started out. People like that had to, back in the day, it used to take actual work and financing to get your ideas out to the broader public. And now you can just, get a camera, get some lights, get a microphone. Okay, it still takes some money, but you understand what I'm saying. The barrier to entry is so much lower. So many more ideas can be spread out there. And some of those are crackpot, terrible ideas and based on propaganda. But some of them spread further than they ever could have before. And again, I think there must be some connection between the change in religious affiliation and the internet. Because the society of the 90s and the 80s was also fairly atomized in the way that it is today. Maybe people saw each other in person slightly more, but overall, no. The real change in society seems to be the fact that information can be propagated much wider, much further, a much more of a chorus of opinion, and different ideas that would not have found a place in mainstream society, would have been marginalized, can be heard. People can make connections across distances that they couldn't before. And this is changing society in ways that the people who are fixated on, banning books from schools because they promote CRT or LGBTQ agenda or whatever they're terrified of this week, they can't control that. And they're almost wasting their time trying to do things like that. And they're fighting a battle that they can't win, or at least not in a fair fight. And that's part of the reason that they're so basically shitting their pants over all this. I think Gen Z terrifies them. I think they look at the younger generations and say, we will never, not only are they more diverse, but we will never change their minds to what we want them to be in any meaningful way. And that our vision of how society is supposed to be is doomed. And they're basically acting like a cornered animal that is lashing out. But that doesn't mean they can't do serious damage in that lashing out. And what I would say to all of you, whether you're one of my YouTube friends and allies who have made videos in the past or make videos currently, or whether or not you can act in terms of your own social media presence, whether it be Facebook or Reddit or TikTok or Twitter or wherever you are, wherever you can get your voice out there, I would say that the time to jump into the fray is now. That there's a lot of angles for attacking this sort of thing. They're in the process of making fools of themselves. And you probably all remember the shift in the cultural conversation that happened maybe 10 years ago or so, in which right-wing people were able to leverage the overreach of, what they call social justice warriors to try and discredit them in the broader public. Well, there's plenty of ways to discredit these fanatical bigots in the eyes of the broader public. Even if it seems like everything is completely polarized, there are plenty of middle-of-the-road people who are not the loudest voices, who can be made to see that, hey, maybe I want to distance myself from this fanatical clown show. In terms of what I personally have planned, I'm working on making videos that explain various aspects of the mechanics and the structure of the Christian nationalist movement, how things are linked between the Christian nationalist politicians, the organizations in Washington, D.C. and at the national level that coordinate with those politicians, other organizations below that reach out to yet other organizations that network with pastors and churches, down to the level of the actual congregations that are turned into the foot soldiers of the movement. There's definitely a structure to it, and this organizational structure is a large reason that they're able to punch far above their weight, because they're simply better focused and better organized. I think there are things to learn to that, maybe so expose how some of it operates and maybe find some of its soft underbelly, and really analyze the belief system of Christian nationalism, and particularly white Christian nationalism, and how it feeds into ideas of America and their kind of armchair sociology and magical thinking that propels them, and pushing back against some of that. Because I think that's an area in which, as polarized of a society as we are, I don't think that the average person in the United States really truly goes in for the kind of magical thinking at the heart of their movement. But there's no singular way to approach this. It's going to take what they call a full court press. And so I leave it at that for now, and I will see you all soon.